Én is köszönettel szeretném kezdeni. Szeretném megköszönni a Dialogórum Oktatás és Kulturális Alapítványnak azt, hogy elhozta Budapestre Pavел Palaschenko urat, és lehetőséget biztosított számunkra, hogy az élő történelmet megismerjük. Mit jelent az, hogy élő történelem? Azt jelenti, hogy Palaschenko úr működő tolmács, aki kormánytolmács, legmagasabb szintű tolmács, aki Bush elnöknek, mind a két Bush elnöknek, Baker, Schulz külügyminisztereknek, Reagan elnöknek, Thatcher miniszterelnöknek, Rajiv Gandhi elnöknek tolmácsolt, és Szovjetunióban pedig Gorbachev, Mihail Gorbachev főtitkár, pártfőtitkár, illetve a továbbiakban a Szovjetunió elnöke, illetve Shevardnadze külügyminisztereknek volt a személytolmácsa. Na most mit lehet még róla tudni? Ő politikai elemző, több könyv szerzője, számtalan cikke jelent meg, publikációi vannak orosz, illetve külföldi sajtóban. Ő diplomata. Beszélni az angol, a francia, a spanyol, az olasz és a német nyelven. De saját elmondása szerint alapvetően az angol meg a francia nyelvet használja. Jelenleg a Gorbachev alapítványnál dolgozik, mint a nemzetközi kapcsolatok és a sajtókapcsolatok osztályvezetője. Palaschenko úr az angol nyelvvel fiatal korában kezdett megismerkedni. 8 éves volt, amikor középiskolai angol tanár édesanyja elkezdte elültetni benne az angol nyelv iránti szeretetet. Ez aztán tovább folytatódott az egyetemen. A nagyon híres moszkvai idegen nyelvek főiskoláját végezte el, és utolsó éves volt, itt egy lábjegyzet, ezt szeretik a tolmácsok, amikor nyílik a zárójel, meg amikor lábjegyzet van. Tehát Oroszországban, illetve jelenleg a Szovjetunióban is a tolmács oktatás 4, illetve 5 éves. Vagyis ez az az idő, amely alatt az ember a nyelvet is megismeri, a szakmát is megismeri, és elegendő gyakorlatot szerez. Különösen fölhívom a figyelmet a jegyzetelés technikára, mint mindnyájunk által kedvelt eszközre. Utolsó éves volt, amikor meghívták az ENSZ tolmácsképzőbe. Akkor, most is működik, ez egy nagyon komoly intézmény, amelyik az ENSZ-ben dolgozó szovjet, illetve most orosz küldöttségeknek a tolmácsait képezte. Úgyhogy Palaschenko úr miután elvégezte ezt a tanfolyamot, 5 évet dolgozott az ENSZ titkárságán. Miután hazatért 80 és 90 között a Szovjetunió külügyminisztériumában dolgozott, először a fordítások, tolmácsolások osztályán, később pedig az Egyesült Államok és Kanada osztályon. És ez alatt az idő alatt részt vett a bécsi hagyományos fegyverzet csökkentési tárgyalásokon. A genfi közepes hatósugarú balisztikus rakéták csökkentésére irányuló tárgyalásokon. Nagyon szerettem, amikor az előadó nem készíti fel a tolmácsokat. Azon kívül a stockholmi Európai Bizalom és Biztonság Erősítő Intézkedések konferenciáján, nemzetközi konferenciákon, ENSZ közgyűléseken tolmácsolt. És 85 óta volt Gorbachev főtitkárnak a tolmácsa, illetve Shevardnadze külügyminiszternek a tolmácsa, és az összes szovjet-amerikai csúcs találkozón ő tolmácsolt. Az amerikai sajtó is ismerősként köszöntötte, mondták, hogy az a bajuszos ember, tudják, mint az a vicc, hogy ki az a két fickó a híres tolmács két oldalán. Ez ő a híres tolmács. És 1992 óta pedig a Gorbachev alapítványnál, ez egy nemzetközi alapítvány, dolgozott mostanáig. 2006 óta tanítja a szinkrontolmácsolást és a konzekutív tolmácsolást, illetve továbbra is tolmácsol. Nagyon sok politikai publikáció szerzője, és van egy csomó könyve. És többek között ez az egyik apropó, ami miatt Budapestre érkezett. Tehát először is 99-ben kiadta a Fordítás világa, vagyis a kölcsönös megértéshez vezető örök út című könyvet. Később egy ennél jóval bonyolultabb elnevezésű könyvet adott ki. A dolgokat más dolgokkal történő összehasonlítás során ismerjük meg. Avagy az angol nyelv nehézségeinek, finomságainak és bölcsességeinek szisztematikus szótára orosz megfelelésekkel. 2002-ben jelent meg az Én nem szisztematikus szótáram című kiadványa. 3 év múlva újraírta az egészet, ez lett a Nem szisztematikus szótár 2005, ahol a legfontosabb dolgot csinálja, amit egy sima szótár nem ad, elmagyarázza, hogy milyen szövegkörnyezetben, milyen esetben lehet használni az egyes kifejezéseket, és mihez kapcsolódnak, milyen felhangjuk van. 97-ben jelent meg az Egyesült Államokban a My Years with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze című könyve. Ez visszaemlékezés, és aztán 2020-ban pedig a Szakma és az idő, a diplomata tolmács feljegyzései című könyve. Nos, ennek a könyvnek a bemutatása lesz majd valamennyi hónap múlva a következő látogatás alkalmából. Először Palajcsenko úrnak fogom átadni a szót, ő angolul fog beszélni, utána pedig kérdésekre fog válaszolni. Egy kérésünk van, hogy aktuál politikai kérdésekkel ne zavarjuk, mert nem emiatt érkezett. Úgyhogy egy élő legendával állnak szembe, kérem, élvezzék a találkozót.
Thank you very much. Joe told you all about my life and career, which is actually what I wanted to talk about. Anyway, I would like to tell you a little bit about my evolution, my development as a professional interpreter, and let me see. We will need to find my file. Yeah, this is it. Okay. I've had an interesting life, surely, and a lot of it was work. It does take hard work to become a professional interpreter. It takes a lot of work and effort to stay in the profession, to reach a certain level of proficiency. But so far as career is concerned, I must say that a lot of it is also luck. I was lucky because when I studied at what is now called the Moscow Linguistic University, at that time it was called the Translation Department of the Marie Thérèse Institute of foreign languages in Moscow. So when I was studying there, this was really the golden age of the translation department. The professors, the teachers that we had were really the best. And that is a generation that is no longer with us, but I always take the opportunity to remember them, to mention specifically some of them. They were really people to whom I owe a lot. But again, it was just my luck that I was studying at that time when the translation department in Moscow really flourished. Then again, I was lucky that my professor who taught me simultaneous interpretation recommended me for the United Nations language training course. It was again a very good and useful year for me. Then I was lucky that nothing inappropriate happened when I was studying there, that I was in good standing with the authorities because, it was the communist period, socialist, officially socialist, and you had to be in good standing in order to be able to go abroad for 5 years and work at the United Nations. The United Nations is an organization, again, to whom I owe a lot. And those 5 years were really, the 5 years that made me the professional, and therefore I am forever grateful to that organization. Then, again, luck. And that is when I returned to Moscow after the mandatory 5 years, no more than 5 years at that time for Soviet UN interpreters. The translation department in the Soviet Foreign Ministry was expanding. I probably would have gone on to teach at the university, at the translation department, but because it was expanding, again, it was a lucky year for those of us who finished working their stint at the UN, and I was accepted into the translation department where I worked from 1980 until 1987. 1987 was the year when I transferred to the USA and Canada Department of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. And again, that was a stroke of luck because when you actually work on the subjects and on the issues that bring together, sometimes very often divide the countries, such as in this case the USA and the Soviet Union, you become a different kind of interpreter, I would say, because you are immersed into the various issues that are happening, the various problems that are happening. You read the diplomatic cables, and that was again an important step forward for me. As Georg told you, I participated in every US-Soviet summit from 1985 until 1991. The final summit in which I participated was the one where the first START treaty, the treaty on the reduction of strategic defensive arms, was signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush. So, as I say, a lot of it is luck. It just so happened that I went through all of those phases in my life, in my career, and well, just to show you some pictures. This one is the unauthorized use of the International Association of Conference Interpreters for their purposes. Is that okay? Want it to be a little bigger?
The presentation will look there.
Yeah, it's over there. So they used this photograph in order to emphasize the importance of the work of the professional interpreter in ending the Cold War. The French here says, who makes it possible for important people to perfectly understand each other? And it so happens that it is me. Well, as I said, I've never been a member of this illustrious organization. I have many friends there, and therefore I never complained that they used this picture. The first US-Soviet summit in Geneva, Reagan and Gorbachev. This is in the Soviet mission. Reagan and Gorbachev did not, become friends immediately, I must say. After the first meeting in Geneva, after their very first actual get-together in Geneva, which lasted for about an hour and a half, Gorbachev said to his people, I've heard that, Gorbachev said to his people that Reagan is a real hawk, more than just a hawk. He said it'll be difficult to deal with him. And Reagan said to his people that Gorbachev is a die-hard Bolshevik, and it will be very, very difficult to deal with him. But they worked on it. The thing about those two men is that they came from extremely different backgrounds, and they were very different in terms of their experiences, in terms of their ideological beliefs. They were totally opposite, but they did want to establish a normal relationship between the Soviet Union and the US. And both of them really, I would say, hated nuclear weapons. You can say that about all of the leaders at that time. For example, Margaret Thatcher believed that nuclear weapons were kind of safeguards of peace, that there was no war between the major powers precisely because they were so afraid that nuclear weapons would be used. So it's important to have nuclear weapons. Thatcher believed that it's important to have nuclear weapons in Europe, not just in those two countries, the US and the Soviet Union, but really it's important to have nuclear weapons in Europe just to guarantee peace. Reagan and Gorbachev both, as I said, hated nuclear weapons, and that was their principal goal, at least to reduce the arsenals of nuclear weapons, which at that time amounted to, globally, to about 50,000 nuclear weapons. So this was kind of working to more and more bring them together. But it was a difficult process, and in Reykjavik, was it a failure or was it a breakthrough? This is the moment when Gorbachev and Reagan said goodbye in Reykjavik, and as you can see, Reagan in particular is frustrated, unhappy, and upset. But at the press conference that Gorbachev held a few minutes after they departed, Gorbachev said, no, this is not a failure, this is actually a breakthrough. We both want nuclear weapons ultimately to be eliminated, and we agreed on the main outlines of future agreements. I interpreted that press conference, and after the initial confusion, and I too was confused when the meeting was over, but after the initial confusion, that really brought hope to me and to many other people, and that is despite the fact that they did not sign anything, despite the fact that they continued to disagree, particularly on missile defense, which Reagan wanted. Gorbachev thought that it would be destabilizing. Despite those disagreements, they agreed on many aspects of the future agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States. But the media, of course, felt that it was a failure, and this is how I saw myself on the cover of Time magazine. There were a couple of other occasions when Time magazine put me on its cover. Of course, it was not me that they were interested in, obviously. Another person who I think was a very important person in the history of US-Soviet relations and in the history of ending the Cold War was Secretary of State George Shultz. And here he is in Moscow in 1987. I think, and here is the US delegation in Moscow trying to hammer out the actual texts of the agreements that Gorbachev and Reagan generally agreed on. They agreed on the outlines, but it was important to write the text of the treaties and the text also of the numerous protocols, memorandums of understanding, and other documents that form part of those treaties. Extremely complicated, difficult treaties. So this is Schultz and his entire delegation. My colleague here, Dmitry Zarechnik, an excellent U.S. State Department interpreter with whom we are still friendly and correspond from time to time. This is Pavle, Rosanne Vitray here, and I think all of us owe a debt to those people on both sides. Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, and this is Alexander Smerny, the late Marshal Alkameyev, and others. But as I said, the initial agreement, the outline of the agreement that was between Gorbachev and Reagan in Reykjavik that was never signed, started to become a reality in Washington in December 1987. Here was Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, President Gorbachev at that time was not yet president, he was the General Secretary of the Communist Party. And the first treaty, the Treaty on Elimination of Intermediate-Range Nuclear Weapons, was signed in December. That was the first step. And I emphasize that word, elimination. Elimination of the entire class, two classes of nuclear missiles, with ranges from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers, 5,000 and 500 kilometers. All of the missiles held by the Soviet Union and the United States were ultimately destroyed, eliminated, and that was the first real disarmament treaty, rather than just a treaty on limitation or reductions. It was a good visit. You can see here a more friendly atmosphere. You can see here that in the private study of President Gorbachev, of President Reagan, Reagan is showing him that study, basically making some small talk. That was the beginning of trust. But trust has to be proven. You know, many politicians believe that trust has no place in international relations. That basically you just have to hold on to your national interest and see whether those interests are compatible with the interests of the other side. But trust is something that is a kind of fiction. I really saw what was happening, and therefore I can disagree with that view, with that opinion. Trust is very important, but trust emerges as you reach agreements. It grows after that first agreement, the first elements of trust emerge. Then after the Soviet Union not just declared that it is withdrawing from Afghanistan, but actually completed that withdrawal within 1 year, that was another step toward trust. So trust is important, but it is the result of common efforts. It is a result of the agreements on specific issues that are reached. And I think this is very important today. We all know what the situation is. So we need to rebuild trust by reaching about that talk, and this, people always ask me whether I can talk about some funny moments, some jokes maybe that the presidents told, or some awkward moments. Not many, I must say, in my arsenal. But this is an interesting one because on the last day of the December '87 visit to Moscow, it was a really pouring rain outside of the White House. So the departure ceremony was under this pouring rain, and as you can see, everyone is equipped with umbrellas. I am the only one who is standing here, and it really drenched me totally. Reagan, as you can see, is holding the umbrella over Nancy. You'll see Gorbachev, the police is here, and the U.S. security guard is holding the umbrella over her. No one is holding an umbrella or whatever over my head, and as I say, I wasn't drenched. So this is what happens sometimes, despite all the efforts of the protocol people and other security people. Reagan came to Moscow in '88, and again, this is a simple show of trust. At Red Square, everyone was asking whether all of the people on Red Square, when Gorbachev took Reagan to show Red Square and also the Kremlin, the Tsar cannon, which was Gorbachev emphasized, never actually fired. But here, and it was near that Tsar cannon, that Reagan was asked in 1988 whether he still believed that the Soviet Union is an evil empire. And without missing a beat, Reagan said, no, I no longer think so, because it is changing, because we're reaching agreements. So that was a really important historical moment. So when they were in Red Square, you see that Red Square is empty, obviously, for security reasons. And a couple of people asked me whether all the people here, the Russians here who greeted Reagan and Gorbachev, whether all of them are KGB people. And I said, certainly not this little man. Gorbachev is old. About the others, I don't know. Probably some of them were. And this is a photo of Gorbachev and Reagan on Red Square. And again, you can see that this is the evolving relationship, that this is a relationship where trust is already present. But with verification. Susan Massey, an American historian, taught Reagan some Russian proverbs. And in particular, the one that Reagan pronounced as doговориться, not проверяй, and that is trust but verify. And Reagan repeated it at every meeting. Of course, verification of arms control agreements is very important. It's true, Gorbachev agreed with that. Here is right after the US elections in 1988, when George Bush, the senior George Bush, was elected. This is at Governor's Island, Gorbachev meeting with two American presidents, President Reagan and President-elect George Bush. Again, my colleague, Dmitry Zrechnik, the U.S. State Department interpreter, is here. And this is a really historic one. Gorbachev, Reagan, and Bush against the background of the Statue of Liberty at Governor's Island in New York. The protocol people didn't want me there. No, they didn't. But Gorbachev wanted actually to talk and not just to pose with those two presidents. And so he asked me to come over. And so some of the pictures are with me, some others are without me. This is what protocol people want. They want only the important people in the picture. Gorbachev and Reagan and Bush and Secretary of State Baker at Malta, the meeting where basically the end of the Cold War was recorded by those two presidents. But you have to confirm that the Cold War is over. When crises begin, then all of those words about the end of the Cold War, they have to be proven. They have to be proven by deeds. And this is an interesting moment here in Irkutsk, where Shevardnadze, my boss at the foreign ministry, and Baker were meeting to basically discuss current affairs. No one expected that they would get some disastrous news during that meeting, but they did. And that was the news of Iraq invading Kuwait and absorbing Kuwait, basically declaring that Kuwait no longer existed. A very clear case of aggression. So you have, again, the two countries, the Soviet Union and the US, have to prove that the Cold War is over by working together to end that aggression. And they did. So I think that was really a critical moment when the first, I would say, proof and the first demonstration of the end of the Cold War and the two nuclear superpowers working together was produced for the world. As you know, Gorbachev and Bush later met in Helsinki. This is the Helsinki summit in September 1990. So they agreed that both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, wanted that aggression to end. They wanted Iraq, the forces of Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi president, to leave Kuwait unconditionally. Unconditionally. And this is what happened. But Bush basically also promised that the US will not go on to invade Iraq after Iraq pulls out of Kuwait. Again, that's how trust emerges and develops. And this is exactly what happened. With the first President Bush, with Bush the father, as we sometimes called him, that agreement was implemented exactly. And I think that was a confirmation of the end of the Cold War. You can see here an interesting cartoon that is not very visible, an interesting cartoon that was presented to both presidents in Helsinki. You see two boxers, and you see the referee right here, the globe instead of his head, and here you see the remnants of the Cold War. And both sides are declared the winners over the Cold War, not the winner of the Cold War. It really was a historic moment. Not that America defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War. That unfortunately became mantra later. But here, this is shown as a common victory over the Cold War. The Cold War was defeated, the Cold War ended without a single shot being fired between the two superpowers. And well, this is, I think this is the moment when they will be signing the START Treaty. The treaty that, together with other uncontrolled agreements, culminated in the elimination and physical liquidation of about 80% of nuclear weapons that had been accumulated over the entire history of the Cold War and the arms race. And this one is really more important. This is at Novo Gorova, Gorbachev's residence, where in a very informal atmosphere, Gorbachev and Bush spent almost the whole day discussing the future. And I must say that it was a future that was very different from the one that unfortunately we are seeing today. Well, this is the book that I think George mentioned. That book was published in the US in 1996, and I am very proud of that book. I wrote it in English. This other one was written in Russian almost 20 years after the first one was written. It is not a translation of this book. It done a little bit of advertising. And now let's talk a little bit about our work insofar as it is affected by politics and insofar as it affects politics. Politics and policy in English, as you might know, are two different words. Whereas policy is the strategic course that a country or a particular political leader develop and try to implement. Policy is basically strategy. While politics is what happens when policy is being implemented. It is the political struggle, it is the political infighting, it is the political life, including elections, including party politics, inside the parties and between the political parties. That is what politics is about. And I would say that our work, my work in my career, our work is affected deeply by both policy and politics. You have to be aware of the subject matter that you are dealing with. I, as I said, particularly when I worked in the USA and Canada Department of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, I was an avid reader of every cable. I was a reader of books on diplomacy, Henry Kissinger's work, the memoirs of Andrei Gromyko, all of those things that enabled me to be aware of the history and the current developments in international relations. In simultaneous interpretation in particular, in any kind of interpretation, but particularly in simultaneous interpretation, it's very important to be able to some extent, predict what the speakers are going to say, what the diplomats, what the leaders are going to say. It cannot be, of course, a kind of 100% prediction, but if you are politically aware, if you study policy and politics, then you can come close to basically being in the know and even to become a kind of predictor of what is going to be said. Of course, unexpected things happen. They happen all the time. But you are better in dealing with the unexpected when you know what's expected. So, whatever will be the area in which you will be working as translators and interpreters, or in which you are working as translators and interpreters, you really have to work hard to study the area that you are dealing with. It is sometimes said that a good interpreter has to know something about everything and all about something. And it's close, I think. It's very close to what we need to do. Currently, I am not working as an interpreter as much as I did 10 years ago. So I have concentrated on some areas where I know that I'm good, because I know the subject matter, particularly arms control, international relations, to some extent, but a lot less so. International organizations such as the UN and the Council of Europe, where I worked until 2019. There is an age limit there, so when I turned 70, I had to discontinue working for that very good organization. The UN has no age limit, and I remember, when I was working there, We had some colleagues who were, like Elizabeth Hayward and Dina Rubinstein and some others, they were. Some of them, I think, were there into their late 70s. But this is unusual. Most of us, I think, would understand that at some point it's important to maybe, take a rest. Anyway, so right now I'm only working in those areas where I am knowledgeable. That's not always the case in our careers because sometimes you have to. Even in international organizations, there are, for example, there would be conferences on pharmaceuticals and agriculture and other things where you're not particularly knowledgeable. And that means that you would sometimes have to work overnight to prepare for just one meeting. And you don't know whether you would ever again interpret at a conference about pharmaceuticals. Well, again, so far as I'm concerned, I prefer to avoid such situations. But the market is the market, and so if you're offered a job at a conference on something that you're not particularly knowledgeable about, you'll sometimes accept, I think. So, as I said, sometimes means working overnight. It means trying to find information which is not always easy in some areas. I remember working in a Council of Europe conference that adopted an international convention, the international convention on organ transplants. And we didn't have much time to prepare. What is more, we didn't have terminology. We had to. I actually complained to people at the Council of Europe that they did not provide any kind of terminology, any kind of glossary, perhaps. Those of us who are in the early years of your career, you really have to think about this as well, and certainly follow what is happening in various areas in order to have at least initial knowledge of many things. Of course, to just go a little bit aside the issues of policy and politics, our profession will be changing because of the artificial intelligence, machine translation. I think for interpreters, for people who do oral interpretation, it'll not be soon that we will be replaced. You will be replaced. Maybe not ever. But in terms of, for example, translation of documents, in terms of translation of scientific papers, even now, some programs and some artificial intelligence programs are doing a reasonably good job. But ultimately, of course, it has to be a human being who corrects the mistakes, but you have to be good, really, to correct the mistakes that machine translations and artificial intelligence will produce. So this is a challenge, and I think that in terms of written translation, probably most of the work will be in editing, will be in consulting, will be in creating terminology, and I don't know Hungarian, but I do know that in Hungarian, borrowings from other languages are very rare, so you really have to work on the terms in order to find a correct and understandable translation of the new terms that keep coming up and emerging in all areas. And some languages don't care, and they borrow. The Japanese, for example, borrow practically all terminology in various areas. Hungarian is not like this, Chinese is not like this, so you really have to work hard, and that will always be the work of human beings. But anyway, going back to the political aspect of our work, just a couple of examples which I think you'll find interesting. In 2017, during the first presidency of Donald Trump, he came to the United Nations. It was his first appearance at the UN, and he made a speech. And in that particular situation, on that particular occasion, he actually read what his speech writers wrote for him. And it was not the easiest speech, the easiest address to interpret. An Iranian TV channel hired an Iranian interpreter to interpret Reagan's speech into, there's no Iranian language, into the Persian language. And let's see what happened. It's a really interesting story. You may not have heard about it. Let's see. So, this is what Trump said. The entire world understands that the good people of Iran want change. And other than the vast military power of the United States, that Iran's people are what their leaders fear most. So, back translated from the Persian, this is what the Iranian interpreter said. So the guy fumbled, whether intentionally or not, we don't know yet. We'll know. This is what Trump said. The Islamic Republic of Iran has turned a wealthy country with rich history and culture, obviously something written by his speechwriter, into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. And the translation. This one is funny as well. This is what causes the regime to restrict internet access, tear down satellite dishes, shoot unarmed student protesters, and imprison political reformers. There are many things happening in Iran that we believe is unacceptable. I think a BBC reporter found the interpreter. And actually, I have a lot of sympathy for the Iranian interpreter, because had he translated faithfully what Trump said, you don't know what might have happened to that interpreter. But he didn't give that explanation for his interpretation. His explanation was different. He said Trump made some remarks in his speech at the United Nations against Iran, which I did not translate. Why did I decide not to translate them? First, these remarks were untrue. Interpreter as editor and censor. Second, they were against my country, and they were against Iran. I think if it was anybody else, they would have done the same. I do not think it would be good if I spoke against my own country on my own national broadcaster. The interpreter added. Well, not the finest moment in his life. I can tell you that, well, when I was working in the foreign ministry, I certainly was mostly translating and interpreting matters relating to relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But at the UN and at the Council of Europe, you interpret all kinds of things. You know, I interpreted Henry Kissinger, not the easiest person to interpret. I interpreted Anwar Sadat, the late president of Egypt, but also interpreted Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda, who came to the United Nations, and I was not particularly happy to interpret what he was saying. And other situations where we as interpreters have to do our faithful best. And that's what we do. As I say, particularly in international organizations. And sometimes, I can tell you, like this interpreter said, this is against my country. sometimes it's worth reminding people that you really have to efface yourself. You really have, as translated, you have to efface your political views. You have to forget about your attitude toward a particular situation or a particular policy. Let me tell you, if there's any person, if there's any political leader whom I admire and will always admire, it's Mikhail Gorbachev. But I do remember occasions when what he said, I believe, was not the best thing to say. Like, for example, after the coup attempt in Poland, 1991, he came back to Moscow and he spoke at a press conference. Probably, he should have postponed it for a couple of days because he was not fully aware of what happened. And at some point he was asked about the future of the Communist Party. And he said that I still believe that the Communist Party is reformable, that it can have a future in our country. And I understood immediately that was in that particular situation when the entire country associated the attempted coup with that Communist Party that betrayed Gorbachev. It was, for him, politically, I understood him as a person, as a human being, but politically it was wrong for him to say that, because it worked against him. But of course, whatever you think about a person, or what he or she said, whether you like him or not, you are doing your job. And sometimes you feel a little awkward doing that, particularly if it's a person you admire, which is just to conclude, a question that people often ask is, what do you do when you interpret and you are, well, at a loss, and you become emotional, you fumble, you want to do your best, and as a result of this, you maybe either you, so to say, turn the volume down, you make the particular phrase or sentence a little milder than what the person has said, or you actually make the tone and the content sharper. And is that acceptable? Well, based on my experience, I know that there are colleagues who disagree. I would say that sometimes it's practically inevitable that you make it a little milder. For what reason, I don't know. And I've heard it so many times, and I've done it a few times. And that is more acceptable than making it sharper, than making it more aggressive. I would say that it's the second thing that we have to do. Neutralize it a little bit stylistically. You don't know a particular phrase, a particular saying, a proverb maybe. It becomes more neutral in your interpretation. Let me tell you, it's not a question. But if it becomes more aggressive, particularly with diplomatic negotiations and political saying, I think the result can be, sometimes at least, what you want to avoid. Ultimately, the purpose of our profession is to contribute to better international understanding. So, if you kind of put your feet on the gas too much, that can have consequences. Something that's a little different is when the word itself is a difficult one. I don't know know whether you have in the Bulgarian language a single translation, a single word to translate the English word adversely. I don't know whether you have that. But in Russian, there is no single word for adversely. It can mean anything from opponent in a discussion to enemy in the battlefield. So, when Gorbachev came to the United States in 1987, Reagan, in his welcoming speech, said, "We are meeting not as allies, but as adversaries." And my American colleagues, I think, made an excellent choice when they chose the Russian word. You know, in international diplomatic negotiations, you always interpret your manner. So you interpret it into a foreign language. They prepared the translation of that welcoming speech. And their interpretation was we're meeting as opponents. The word that they chose was closer to opponents rather than enemies. I think the translation that would be close to enemies would have been an almost catastrophic mistake. But the word adversary can actually mean enemy. If it is a discussion of a battlefield situation, adversary is enemy or potential enemy. So that choice of word was, I think, exactly right. And I noticed that at that time, and I'm still recalling it in my lectures, in my lectures like this one. This is not a lecture, but anyway, I still remember it because I think it's a very useful example of translators, interpreters doing their job exactly right. Well, questions?
Készítettem néhány spontán kérdést. Először is azt szeretném megkérdezni, hogy hogyan lett az idegen nyelvek főiskoláján tanuló egyszerű diákból ilyen komoly szakember, diplomata. Fiatal korában vajon ilyen karrierről álmodott?
Not just, you know, when I was a student, but even after I returned from the UN, I thought that, well, it was good while it lasted, as they say. I was not expecting that I would be hired by the foreign ministry. I was not, when I was 18, 16, or when I returned from the UN, I was 30 years old. I never really dreamed of becoming a diplomatic interpreter or becoming a diplomat. I was not a big fan of the Soviet system. I was a loyal Soviet citizen, but not a big fan. And that was one reason that I was not, you know, very eager to go into kind of political or diplomatic life. As I said, those were still the golden years of the Department of Translation of my college, of my Institute of Foreign Languages, and I would have been perfectly happy to work as a teacher, to join the translation department, and it would have been a different life, but I would have been quite happy. As I said, some of it is always luck, and the luck for me was, as I said, the expansion of the translation department. When I joined the translation department in the foreign ministry, it had like 5 English translators. When I was leaving it in '87, we were, I think, at least 20. So a whole generation was added, so to say, to that translation workforce in foreign languages. So some of it is luck, and as I said, I have not such dreams. It would have been a different life, but teaching would have been good to me. Certainly, all of my colleagues who took advantage of that lucky moment, most of them are alive and well. All of us recall that as a really has told a lot for us, and we are very happy that we were able, particularly in those years, to have a job that contributed to normalization, to the 30 years of normal life that the world and Europe had after the end of Cold War. So it's both things, luck, and I'm happy that I was able to contribute.
Hallgatóimnak azt szoktam mondani, hogy első foglalkozáson, hogy szokják meg, hogy a tolmács kiszolgáló személyzet. Olyan, mint a pincér, akit nem is veszünk észre a vacsora vagy az ebéd alatt. A tolmács is akkor jó, hogyha nem veszik észre. Na persze, de közben dolgozik. Azt szeretném megkérdezni, hogy hogyan viszonyulnak a politikusok a tolmácsokhoz. Ez vajon országfüggő, vagy személyfüggő?
Well, I have a lot of respect for waiters, but I would say that our work is somewhat different. And therefore, yes, I mentioned in my remarks that interpreters have to be almost invisible. They have to be able to efface themselves, as John Le Carré said in, I think, one of his articles. But I would say that to the question of whether it is country-specific, country-dependent, or personally specific, so far as I'm concerned, for some reason, we did develop a relationship with, I did develop a relationship with both Shevardnadze and Gorbachev. And it starts when they ask you questions. That's when it starts. Gorbachev started asking me questions, I think, in '87, after about 2 years of me working with him. So, Shevardnadze, I think, even earlier. Shevardnadze had a difficult beginning because he never, well, maybe as a member of the Politburo, he, of course, was aware of international politics, but he was not a diplomat when he was appointed. So he consulted, he asked questions, he developed a relationship, including personal relationships with some of the diplomats who worked with him. And, you know, as I said, it starts when the person you're working with as interpreter begins to ask you questions, and in '87, I think a personal relationship began to develop between me and him. As a general matter, I think you're exactly right. As a general matter, you're exactly right. The interpreter has to be modest. The interpreter has to be helpful. The interpreter has to respect the person she's working with. Maybe, you know, if she doesn't have respect for a particular person, maybe he or she should consider not working for that person. But it's not always possible. So my recommendation is exactly that. Be modest, be helpful, be respectful of the person you're working with. If you are working at diplomatic negotiations or at negotiations between corporations, business companies, please remember that you have to earn the trust of both sides. Even though you're working for one side, you have to earn the trust of both sides. And that advice, I think, is extremely important because there are situations where it's not easy to navigate that particular sphere. Let me just say that I was in a similar situation. That was when Gorbachev was no longer president, and he was invited by the King of Spain, the previous King of Spain, to his palace, and there was a dinner. There were many people there, and he said the same thing to the king, and the king overruled his chief of protocol. The chief of protocol said, no, in our situation in this palace, the interpreter always sits behind the principal. Gorbachev protested, and the king agreed, and that's what happened. So yes, he was that kind of person. Let me also say, just as an aside, that he had tremendous respect for your country. He had tremendous respect for the leaders that I think organized a relatively smooth, a very smooth transition from the communist system to a democracy, including Dulacorn, whom he knew very well. And I was working all these years until Gorbachev died in the Gorbachev Foundation, and I remember that he was very upset when Dulacorn fell ill. It was a rather long illness, and she sent a letter to him with wishes for quick recovery. And as I said, all of those countries that were able to transition successfully, all of those countries and all of those leaders, he really had tremendous respect for them. So just wanted to add that.
Voltak-e nehézségei a humor tolmácsolásával? Voltak-e olyan ügyfelei, akik kifejezetten szerették a poénokat, a vicceket, ezzel megnehezítve a tolmács életét?
Both Gorbachev and Shevardnadze improvised their jokes, and that made it very difficult. They also, from time to time, would use proverbs. Gorbachev's English was very limited, but he did recognize some words and sometimes tried to follow the translation. Shevardnadze had no English, but as I said, their jokes were improvised and that made it not always easy. But whether or not the joke is improvised, for Reagan, I think there was a whole team of speechwriters, as any president has a team of speechwriters, but we understand that there was also a joke writer among them. I mean, doesn't in any way diminish my respect for President Reagan. He was not an easy person to deal with, but, well, they ended the Cold War. And, for example, the remark that Reagan made in the Kremlin when he and Gorbachev approached the Tsar cannon, that huge broken cannon that is in the Kremlin, and when Reagan said, no, I no longer think that the Soviet Union is evil empire, that was situational, that was improvised, and it was, I think, practically the end of the Cold War. So the jokes, you cannot really be ready for jokes, whether they are improvised or not. And you know, sometimes it doesn't even have to be a joke. I remember how the head of the Soviet delegation at the talks on intermediate nuclear missiles said that the American zero option is really a hope. And so bublik is a kind of Russian pastry. So of course I didn't know the word for bublik, but I remember donuts. Donuts in New York, where I lived, working at the UN for 5 years. And donut also has a hole. And so I said, this is the hole of the donut. And it resonated, it worked. So it's always difficult, it's always unexpected, you cannot always do your best. Any interpreter who will tell you that he or she always, in all situations, provided a perfect translation. Well, out of respect, you may want to believe them, but I'm not sure that it's always true. So, we have our problems, and jokes are sometimes one of those problems. But they did tell jokes to each other, something that in Russian is called anecdote, which is not anecdote, not the English word anecdote. The English word anecdote is a situation from real life that may or may not be funny. Anecdote in Russian is a joke, and very often not a good joke. That may be a problem. There is possibly an apocryphal story about a conference where a Russian or an English speaker spoke in South Korea. And the speaker told jokes that no one understood, but he expected applause. And so there was a Korean there who gave a sign to the audience that they should applaud.
A 80-as évek második felében, amikor már idehaza szabadabb volt a légkör, akkor nagy probléma volt a viccekkel, mert amikor a szovjet delegációval lementünk valahol a vidékre, Zalánba, Vasba, és ott fogadta őket a megyei pártitkár, akkor a hivatalos rész után következett a pince látogatás. És a pincében körülbelül beszélgetés egy óra múlva arra terelődött, hogy azt mondja el a kedves elvtársnak, hogy ez a hülye Brezsnyev meg a Kádár találkozik, ezek voltak az igazán nehéz helyzetek. Akkor ki kellett találni helyette egy másik viccet, amin a másik nevetett. A magyar nyelvvel kapcsolatban nagyon sok vita zajlik, hogy kell törekednünk a szép magyar beszédre, vagy pedig fogadjuk el, hogy a beszéd egyre slempliánabbá válik, fogjuk rá, hogy ez a nyelvfejlődésnek egy szakasza. Ugyanakkor Franciaországban van egy állami program, amely a francia nyelvet támogatja. Spanyolországban a Tudományos Akadémia állítja össze a helyes spanyol beszéd szótárát. Németországban, Ausztriában tanítani csak Hochdeutschen szabad. Na most mi a véleménye? Kell-e védenünk a szép beszédet, kell-e törekednünk a nyelv helyességére?
This is a difficult question because languages evolve, languages change. Very often they're not changing in the way that you like. And for interpreters, this is sometimes a real dilemma, I think. It is sometimes a real dilemma whether you want to, when something vulgar, for example, is being said, whether you want to actually render that vulgarity. As a general rule, I would say yes, do your best to sound vulgar. But it's not exactly what you asked, but I just wanted to say one thing. For example, there is in every language vocabulary that is regarded as inappropriate or obscene. There are interpreters who believe that every English word, the interpreters and translators who interpret and subtitle movies, films. So there is a rather famous Russian film interpreter. He's kind of now dabbling in politics, but his initial career was in audiovisual interpretation. And so he believes that every inappropriate English word has to be translated into Russian by what is called in Russian mat, and that is obscene language. So inappropriate into obscene. What I think he doesn't take into account is that the Russian obscene vocabulary is a lot more obscene than English or French. It basically, I would say, uses everything that for many people is or supposed to be dear or even sacred, and in a way vulgarizes a lot more than English words that are inappropriate or are supposed to be inappropriate. So you really have to be very cautious about those things. As for the particularly new words or borrowed words that young people like to use and that sometimes are used by people who are older but who want to keep pace with the development of the language and sometimes to pander to a certain kind of audience. Do you want to use those words in your interpretation, or I would say in your speech, when in life, in your speech? I would recommend that, as I say in Russian, there's a Russian phrase, don't run ahead of the train. don't be the first to show that you are familiar with those things. Don't be the first to use language that for some people may be either difficult to understand or even hard to accept. So again, this is where some caution is, I think, necessary. But it's your judgment call, as they say. You know, it's your judgment. No one can be sure in every situation what the correct decision, what the correct solution to the problem is. But you're certainly right that you also have to bear in mind what the linguistic policy of a particular country is. Certainly in France, they work very hard to have a language that evolves, but in a rather conservative way. And that concerns both new language and also borrowings from other languages. As I said, in Russia, the tendency is to borrow more and more and more. I may not like it, but that's what happens. But you don't need to accept it immediately. When it becomes a norm, then yeah, you have to agree with it. But don't run ahead of the train.
Szeretném megkérdezni a tisztelt közönséget. Van-e valakinek kérdése előadónkhoz?
És bár szerintem mindenki számára nyilvánvaló, de szeretnék még egyszer felhívni a figyelmet arra, hogy kerüljünk bármilyen aktuál politikai vonatkozású kérdést vagy kommentet. Szépen kérek erre mindenki. Köszönjük. Szerintem, mivel a vezetékes a mikrofon, elég bajosan tudnám odavinni, úgyhogy hangosan kérlek szépen, hogy mondjad, hogy a kollégák is tudják tolmácsolni.
I would like to share a personal thought with you and ask a question. I think the interpreters are the real heroes of the diplomacy. And you were a real hero too at the end of the Cold War. That's very respectful. And the question is, what did you feel when you heard the news when Gorbachev died? Did you stand for him or not?
Well, I started working with him in 1985 and worked with him until his death. I talked to him 10 days before his death on the phone. And so, very frankly, he was in bad shape, and so all of us thought that the end is coming, but when it comes, it's very upsetting, and this was to me very sad news, because it was in 2022, which is what is it? 40 years, more than 40 years, almost 40 years. Knowing him, working with him, agreeing with him, disagreeing with him, sometimes giving him advice. He gave me a lot of good advice. I think I avoided many mistakes, but by just being aware that if I make this mistake, this will be upsetting, this will be bad for him. You know. So, yeah, well, what else can I say? He is a big part of my life.
What does it take to artificially induce memory loss? Artificially induced memory loss in your profession. Forget what you heard. Okay.
Well, frankly, I never really thought that was important. You forget something. The fact that you forget certain things is an important part of the human psyche and an important part of memory. if you remember everything that happened in your life or in your profession, I think that would be something that would probably be impossible. It's just impossible. You don't remember certain things because they're not important. The important things you do remember. If I don't talk about certain things, it doesn't mean that I forgot them. It doesn't mean that I induced the forgetting. I don't think so. But I don't believe that interpreters have to carry a lot of things into their graves. I don't think so. In my books, I write honestly about what I saw within certain limits. Those limits, to some extent, are related to secrecy, but in most cases, those limits are related, I think, to just questions of moral character, of tact, of being respectful to the people whom you knew. But it's not induced forgetting. It's not induced forgetting. It's just that you remember it, but you feel that for reasons either of secrecy or of morality, you don't want to write about. Unfortunately, some people, but not interpreters, I don't know of a single occasion where interpreters would write in their memoirs or would talk to other people about things that should not be mentioned. I've read a number of books written by my colleagues, and I think all of them are respectful, all of them understand that there are certain limits, and they observe those limits. In the foreign ministry and then in the office of the president, no one said to me that I cannot talk to the media. No one. As I understand, in your State Department, you really cannot talk to the media. You cannot. I was not just an interpreter. I worked as a diplomat in the USA desk of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. And all of us were allowed to talk to the media. That was certainly different from the pre-Gorbachev time, very different from the time before Gorbachev. But we all understood that there are certain things we can talk about and certain things we cannot talk about, like any diplomat. So I would say that I never went beyond those limits. If I did, then my career would be quite different. It would be the end of any diplomat's career. And I know such cases, such situations, but not interpreters. But some diplomats, when they go beyond the red line, it can end rather badly for them, including, they would just be fired. That can happen, it did happen, but we interpreters are cautious and careful people.
Constant background preparation. of the opinion that interpreters should work primarily from their mother tongue or their A language into their best foreign language, their B language. And the concept was supposedly that we understand everything in our mother tongue, and our B language may not be just quite so perfect, but certainly very good, and we would be able to render anything into our first foreign language. Conversely, the European School of Interpreter Training was of the opinion, and has still been, that interpreters should be trained to work into their mother tongue from as many foreign languages as they can master. Obviously, there are mature languages, etc., but that's beside the time. Now, given these two concepts, in your professional career, did you work predominantly from Russian into English and possibly French, or from English and French into Russian?
Well, actually, you may or may not be right about this being the characteristic and feature of the Soviet or Russian approach to interpretation, or actually of the European approach to interpretation. It's rather utopian to think that, well, in an international organization like the European Union, that there would be interpreters who would interpret from the Maltese or Irish into their mother tongue. Mostly it is done, or Arabic at the UN. Mostly it is done by native Arab speakers who interpret from Arabic into English and from English into Arabic. So in the Russian booth it's different. In the Russian booth, that's what you call the European approach. We work at the UN or in the Council of Europe from foreign languages. You must have at least two into Russian. Supposedly, you are not using the relay from other booths too often, from the English booth for the most part. But it does happen. It does happen because, for example, an interpreter may not be, we have at the Council of Europe, for example, normally a situation where interpreters have different second languages. And so in the booth, there has to be an interpreter whose second language is French, if there's a French speaker, we turn to Russian, and also a guy whose second language is Spanish, or someone whose first or second language, foreign language, is German. But it's not always that you have such a combination. So sometimes my German is not good enough to do oral interpretation. It's good enough to read a newspaper, but that's it. So I don't have German. My colleague too doesn't have German, so I have to use the English relay. And the relay from the English booth is almost always very good. So that's okay. And therefore, I think that those lines are currently blurred somewhat. And therefore, in my professional career, it depended on where I worked. I was fortunate enough to work at the UN, to work at the Council of Europe, to work at OSCE, and in all those international organizations, you work into your native tongue. But I did take the exam to do interpretation at the UN from, they didn't have enough Russian interpreters, so or interpreters from Russian into English. So I took the exam both from Russian and from French. And from Russian it was very good, from French it was satisfactory into English. It's a little difficult to work from one foreign language into another. I'm very frank with you, I'm not a miracle worker. But I did take the exam, and sometimes they used me in the English booth, but not very often. They used me also in the English booth sometimes in the Council of Europe. But mostly in international organizations, I've worked into Russian, but in diplomatic negotiations, I've worked into English because that's the accepted norm in diplomatic negotiations. You translate your guy, or if it is a lady, you translate your boss from your language into English. My American colleagues translated from English into Russian. Most of them had excellent Russian, because most of them were of Russian origin. Dmitry Brezhnev, my colleague who we saw in the pictures, he's of Russian origin. Actually Ukrainian, but his family was Russian. Some other very good State Department interpreters were also of Russian origin, and they translated from English into Russian. So there are two different rules in different settings.
A tolmácsolási módra kérdezni. Előfordult-e, hogy államfő is találkozom, vagy egyetem? Vagy ez egyáltalán kizárólag? És ugye a jegyzetekkel utána mi történik? Kilopta, összekötve, vagy el?
Actually, when I was working at the Foreign Ministry in negotiations between Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and their American and British counterparts, during the initial couple of years, I actually later went to a room where a typist was ready to record my my memory, and the memory was based on the notes that I took to record the memorandum of conversation. And my American colleagues did the same thing. At a certain point in time, between Geneva and Reykjavik, our bosses, both on the US side and on the Russian side, decided, I think properly, that it's too much of a workload. After 2 hours of negotiations, it takes at least 3 hours to dictate your notes for the memorandum of conversation. And so at Reykjavik, they had note takers, the diplomats, that took notes and then dictated them to the typist, and it was their responsibility. They would sometimes check with me whether they heard exactly and whether their understanding was correct. But it was no longer my responsibility. And I understand that this continues right now. But sometimes there are really one-on-one discussions. And here you are still responsible. Sometimes they want, very rarely, they want only the interpreter of one side to be present. But it happens very rarely, it's not a good situation, actually. And you remember during Trump's first term, there was a big debate, and they even wanted the American interpreter to actually give evidence during the Senate hearings. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. They were able to ultimately work it out. The interpreter has to keep the secrets. The interpreter knows about many things that, at least in the immediate aftermath of the negotiations, is top secret. But certainly, I did take notes, always. Because sometimes they would speak for 5 minutes, and they don't want to interrupt their thought, their remark. This happened with Gorbachev quite often. It happened with Reagan and some others. Sometimes they are very considerate of the interpretation, and they would speak in shorter sentences for maybe a minute or half a minute. That's where you are, you don't have a problem. But, you do take notes. And taking notes is a kind of art, because you cannot have stenographic notes. You're not a stenographer. And therefore, you use some symbols, you use some shortenings, abbreviations, you use some acronyms, but ultimately, most of what you use is memory. Well, спасибо, что being not too resilient to stress in everyday situations, on the subway in Moscow, or at home with my wife, but in those political settings where I worked, frankly, I didn't feel the stress. Maybe it's because of the motivation. Maybe it's because I felt that I was doing something important. So stress did not affect me.
Is that responsibility?
It's motivation. Motivation. You know, as I told you, initially as a young man, I was not very politically active, not a big fan of the system. But when I started working, number one, I understood my responsibility, but number two, I think I began to understand better, the motivation of my side in particular, the motivation of the other side. It was also interesting, and that, I think, too, helps you deal with stress. When you like your work, when you... Excuse me?
What was your motivation?
Well, as I say, my motivation was that particularly when Gorbachev came in, I felt that things were changing in the direction that I respected, in the direction that I thought was good ultimately for my country. And that's motivation. Yeah. But as I said, one would sometimes succumb to stress in situations that aren't worth it. But when the situation is worth it, it helps you to avoid stress. I recently wrote a little piece, it's also here in the book, where I remember my participation in the Soviet delegation during Gorbachev's visit to China. China was not my area, but there was a press center there, and so they wanted me to be there to interpret into English for foreign correspondents Gorbachev's remarks at the press conference. And I can tell you, because it was not really my area, I watched what was happening. Gorbachev was there when there was the student uprising at Tiananmen Square. And that, I remember that affected me very deeply, psychologically. All of us were, I think, really very confused about what was happening. We didn't know how it would end, but we did know that Gorbachev's visit has to end in full normalization of relations. And that was stress. But I was not directly involved. Anyway, let me just say that I was told that there are people from various associations of translators and interpreters and also students. And I know that I would have brought more books, but I have just one copy of my memoirs and one copy of the book that I wrote with my colleague Mihaila Gorbachёva that is called What is Not in the Dictionaries and What is Not in the Grammars. And it's for the Russian-English and English-Russian combination, but I think it might be interesting for others as well, even if you don't know Russian. The examples, the English examples that are difficult to translate, you can easily read them, and probably that will be useful for you. But as I said, I have just one copy of each, so I give it to George. But if others are interested, you can easily find, there's a publishing house in Moscow, and fortunately the post, the mail, is still working, and you can order those books from that publishing house called Auditoria. So you can order those books, and they will be at your desk in 12 days. Even in the current, as they say, geopolitical situation, the mail is still working. So hopefully it will be interesting, particularly for those of you who have Russian, but also English, and the book My Years of Gorbachev and Shevardnadze but now it's still in print and you can order it from Amazon.
Thank you. Anyway, this is my role as a co-MC. By the way, if you don't feel any stress in this job, you don't feel anything in your stomach, you're not doing your job well. So,
But you have to be resilient too. You have to be resilient too. You really have to work on that.
actually, I had like 5 pages of questions, which I'm now going to read out loud. No, because our time is unfortunately up. So, but anyway, I'm going to misuse my role, so I will have to ask you one last question. How did you translate into English glasnost and perestroika?
It was not my decision, but it was the decision of the US media, mostly US media, because it was in English. In other languages, I'm not sure, but I think they too just adopted those words. But perestroika initially was translated by reporters from Moscow as restructuring. And that is not a good way to translate it, because it was not a matter of restructuring, it was a matter of, particularly during the 5 years of perestroika, a really total change. Really change that started as a somewhat modest attempt to improve the system to an attempt to change the system, to replace the whole system. That is what was happening in 1989, 1990, and so restructuring was not a good way. Glasnost, they initially translated as openness, then they tried transparency. All of that is not a good way to translate that. So I think that the decision to actually borrow the words into English was a good one. But as I said, different languages are different in their approach to borrowing. Some languages are receptive to borrowing words. Some languages are not really receptive to it. So as I understand Hungarian, in this regard, is a difficult language because it is not receptive to foreign words. My attempt to translate perestroika as the process of change did not work, precisely because, it was overtaken by events. By that time, they already chose borrowing as the right approach to translating those two words, perestroika and glasnost. A similar Russian word, siloviki. Siloviki is the officials of defense and security agencies, of which there are plenty in my country. So sila is force or power. So initially, reporters who actually are the decisive force in this process translated it as power agencies or power officials. And that's not a good way, again. And so ultimately they decided to borrow, and they say siloviki, and in brackets they add national security officials. Well, as I say, it's something that each language, each country, each linguistic policy chooses depending on the condition, depending sometimes on the political factor, sometimes on the stylistic factor. So it's a difficult one. It's really difficult. But as I said, ultimately many languages decided to adopt those two words into their languages.
Thank you, Pavel. Actually, Hungarian is very similar to Russian, because one of our great colleagues and lecturers and professors, Pavel, he translated schlongutz into French as schlongutz. You don't understand that? It's a dish. Anyway, so, well, thank you very much. We're all very, very thrilled. Please give a big noise, make a big noise for Pavel now. And also make a big noise for our young colleagues, the interpreters. Let me be very, very frank. I wasn't fully satisfied with the performance, that's why I went there. And once I sat there, I realized that it's very, very difficult. I mean, it's about Fuller because, well, it's a challenge. So congratulations, all of you. Thank you. And now, one of the co-organizers is LPS, the Organization of International Protocol Professionals, the president of which organization is here. She's just standing behind you, and she would like to say something. Köszönjük szépen Possó Niki elnök asszonynak, hogy átadja Pávelnek az ajándékot.
Thank you all for coming and for your questions.
Még egyszer nagyon szépen köszönjük az elszének. Kedves figyelnek, és a szoknak és elsősorban önöknek nektek, hogy